Hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. I set up this podcast to provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, so if that sounds like the kind of thing that's useful for you, please consider pressing subscribe. In the episode today, I'm going to be looking at a case study involving a team member who's not pulling their weight. They're reliant on AI tools and they're, to some extent, passing it off as their own work, and what they're delivering is too superficial. So you are in a dilemma of whether or not you decide to raise it with them and potentially renegotiate the workload, etc., or you just take an accommodating approach and basically do the work for them. So I decided to talk about this particular topic for a couple of reasons. First, I was speaking with somebody just recently and they were in this exact situation themselves. They were preparing an application for something external to their organization, and there was a group of them working on it, and their immediate superior manager had given them a little bit of a draft to work on, but it was, to be frank, not very useful at all from the sounds of it. Very generic, and using Gen AI tools to sort of put together a lot of the outline as well as the actual information that was in the document. And so I decided that I would actually use Gen AI to come up with a similar case study because I didn't want to expose this person's personal information just to de-identify it a little bit. So that's one reason, is because I know that it's a prevalent example for this person, but also for a lot of others as well. But I think using these kind of case studies is also quite a good opportunity to explain some of the other frameworks that I've talked about in previous podcast episodes. And today I'm going to be focusing on the 5 types of conflict: data conflict, interest, values, structure, and relationship. And I'm going to explain how each of these different elements could show up in the case study. This is just my thoughts. You might notice different things. There might be different elements of it that jump out at you, for example. But it's a really helpful tool to use because if we can become more clear about what the drivers are for this particular conflict situation, it often opens the door for us to respond differently. So first I'm going to read the case study and then I'm going to do a little bit of case study analysis. So here's the case study. In a recent group project involving 3 team managers, we were responsible for preparing a detailed report for an internal strategy review. While I took the lead in structuring the content and another team member contributed in parts, the third team member's involvement was noticeably limited. This is where the issue is. Their main contributions were generated using AI tools, but submitted without any critical editing or context, and the content was often vague, overly general, and lacked the depth required for our audience. The challenge is that this person holds a more senior role than I do, which makes it difficult to know whether raising the issue is worth the potential fallout. I'm left questioning whether to speak up or let it go, or just quietly rework their sections myself. Well, gosh, even looking through that scenario, I can certainly feel my own memories being triggered when I've worked in group projects, and there have been people that weren't pulling their weight, particularly university group projects. I don't know if any of you listeners have been involved in those kind of situations, but man, they can be awkward when you've got 1 or 2 people that are not pulling their weight. And I think this over-reliance on AI is something that a lot of more people are coming across in their work as well. Colleagues overly using AI and needing to make decisions around what's an appropriate way to use it and where should the limits and boundaries be, for example. But I think one of the things that many people feel is that there should be some type of transparency. Like if there's AI used in this document, then potentially it should be noted somewhere, for example. So I don't know if you've ever been in a similar kind of situation like this, but they can be very difficult to navigate, especially in the heat of the moment. It's not always easy to know which is going to be the best way forward. So if we can pause and do a little bit of conflict analysis, it really just helps us to expand the set of options that we're considering. So let's think about this particular case study. The first layer that you'll often notice in any conflict situation is the relationship conflict type. That's the first type of conflict that I often talk about because you'll notice it first. But in terms of how we actually intervene in it, I often suggest that it might be better to leave this one until last. So here the relationship conflict question would be, how are the reciprocal interactions between you and the team member? For example, did they miss a previous deadline and you just let it go? Well, that might mean that there's a expectation of tolerance or an unrealistic precedent that the person might feel has been set. Or maybe you have been too micromanaging in the past, so they might be retreating just because they feel like you've been too over the top. Maybe they feel like you've been too harsh or aggressive or something like that, and so they're trying to avoid you. So this is thinking through, how has our relationship with the other person potentially contributed to this problem? And I think it's often when we've been too accommodating, too flexible, too soft, and they might feel like they can walk all over the top of us, so to speak. Or it might be that we've come across as too harsh, critical, judgmental, something like that, and the person is experiencing some type of a defensive response. And regardless of those, I think often the opportunity to mend the bridges, so to speak, is in raising the issue, then de-escalation, and then setting up a conversation focused on the future and the solutions. If the relationship conflict is contributing to this, then it's likely that there's a reasonable level of emotion involved. That often goes hand in hand. They kind of go along in the passenger chair a lot of the time. And so when we're dealing with that kind of strong emotion, we need to prepare to de-escalate at the beginning of the conversation. So even though you might have ideas around options of what might work, talking through your relationship with the other person, for example, just discussing your goals. Look, we don't need to be mates. We don't need to be best friends or anything, but I do want to find a way to work together effectively. At the moment, it feels like there might be some issues going on, and I'm wondering if maybe we could tweak the communication. We might get things back on track. What do you think? I might be misreading things. What's your take on the situation? That kind of thing. So it's setting the goal. What kind of relationship are we actually aiming for here? And from there, you can often do the solution focused planning. What kind of steps are we going to take to move in that direction? But although you'll notice this type of relationship conflict first, the person's not responding to you, there seems to be some tension between you or something like that, you're not going to get very far in terms of progress if underneath it there's an issue with the data. Like they're not clear about what they're actually meant to be doing anyway. Well, there's no point doing the relationship building kind of stuff. It would be much better to clarify the expectations. So that's the first type of conflict, relationship conflict. The second type of conflict that you'll often come across is what's called data conflict. This is conflict about the information. It's conflict about what has been agreed to. It could be conflict about our expectations and what we think is going to happen, or what we interpreted from the other person's communication, that kind of thing. So in this particular scenario, with the group project and the person isn't pulling their weight, I suppose the data conflict question would be about, how have these arrangements been agreed to? How did you come up with the plan around who was meant to be doing what? And in terms of the communications and the contribution, I should say, themselves, how clear are you all about what was expected from one another? Because it's possible that the other person misinterpreted what you said, or they're looking at the same email as you and interpreting it quite differently. So that would be the data layer. It's kind of like, what have we agreed to do? So if they're not doing what they've agreed to do, then it might be relationship conflict. But if there's ambiguity in what we've actually agreed, then that would be data conflict. And the best way to deal with this data conflict typically is to clarify the expectations moving forward. Normalize the difference. Look, we've all got different expectations here in terms of uni assignments, and we've all got different ideas around who's meant to be doing what. Or we've all got different ideas around what's the best way to respond to this kind of client, or how quickly we should respond, or how accommodating we should be, for example. So it's just normalizing the fact that we're probably going to have two different perspectives here. Let's organize a time to get on the same page moving forward. So relationship conflict and data conflict are the first two that you might consider. The next one, though, is interest. And then after that, we've got values conflict. So the person not pulling their weight, if it's interest conflict, it's not because they don't understand what they should be doing. They know what they should be doing. It's just they've got other things to do. They've got a better use of their time. They can go and work and make money. They can hang out with their partner and enjoy time a lot more. They could hang out with their friends. They could watch TV. They could surf the internet, whatever. Like, it's just these are the other options that the person's got. That's their interest. And they might not necessarily have anything to gain from contributing more. If they know that you're going to cover for them, then effectively their interests are safe, if you know what I mean. Whereas your interests are basically in polar opposites to theirs. You want to limit the amount of time you spend on this project because you've got better things to do with your time as well. But there's other interests that are shared, but you might interpret them differently. Like, for example, in a university group assignment, you might all get the same grade. So your interest might be that you need to get a certain grade level for a scholarship or something like that, in which case you would be valuing that much more than the other person who didn't particularly care as long as they pass. So if the person's not pulling their weight here, it's not because there's a lack of clarity, it's because there's something getting in the way of it. And when we're dealing with interest conflict, the challenge is that there's no magic wand that we can wave. Like someone's going to have to spend the time putting this report together, right? It's going to be you or it's going to be them. Someone's going to need to redo this work. It's going to be you or it's going to be them. So when we're dealing with the interest conflict layer here, that's where we really do need to decide how prepared we are to disappoint the other person. Like this is our boss, so that comment about the potential fallout of raising the issue is certainly relevant. And you might decide that actually it makes more strategic sense for me to take a very accommodating approach at the moment and just go with the flow, keep them happy. I've got a promotion application in the works at the moment, so the last thing I want is to rock the boat right now. But with other people in the group, you might decide to take more of an assertive kind of approach and hold the ground, stick to your guns. You might say to them, this is what's expected. This needs to be done by this date. If it doesn't happen, this is what the consequence would be. And we follow up with it more diligently, and we don't offer flexibility when they give us an excuse or something like that. Or we could compromise and meet in the middle. If you can just fix this section, then I'll do the rest of it. If you can at least get it this far, then I can carry on from there. Or can you go and do the next project that we're working on and I can wrap this one up? So that's the interest layer. You can decide how assertive to be, and really we've got the end of being very, very accommodating through to compromise, right through to just directing. This is what's going to happen. You're going to be doing this. And if it doesn't happen, this is what the consequence would be. So we've talked through relationship conflict, data conflict, and interest conflict. The fourth type of conflict is what's called value conflict. This could be conflict due to the big worldview values that you've got. For example, like you might have a value that we should all be team players. If I'm on a group with other people, then I should be pulling my weight and contributing relatively equally. Whereas the other person might have a different value. They might think that the younger people in the group should contribute more than the senior people. They might feel like people who are parents should be given some level of flexibility versus people who don't have kids to worry about. They might feel that because of their particular personal circumstances, like their background, or I don't know, they have some personal characteristic like a disability or something like that. So they might have a value that they expect something from the other members of the group as well. So with all of these different ideas around what should happen, ultimately they're subjective and there's no true right and wrong. So often the best way to deal with this value conflict would be to name the difference and then to set up the conversation about how this can be managed moving forward. So in the value conflict here, it might be that the team member doesn't actually think that they've done anything wrong. They might think, what's the big deal? Isn't everyone using AI right now? Like, why are you making a mountain out of a molehill? This is only worth 10% of our grade. Like, what's the big deal kind of thing? So if we're going to deal with the conflict at that value layer, it would often be about normalizing their perspective as well as ours. That makes sense. I can understand where you're coming from. We do all have different ideas around how important grades are, and we've probably all got a slightly different idea about what expectations we have from the other people we work with. On my end, though, I've got a different take on it. So I wanted to talk to you about what kind of contribution you can make so that we're on the same page. So a similar approach would be taken in this case study example here. With the group project and the person's not contributing and we're dealing with it with value conflict, then it would be about setting up the value discussion. Look, I just wanted to touch base because it seems like we've got different expectations of one another, and I'd like to organise a time to get on the same page. So it's normal. It's understandable that we're going to have different perspectives here. Let's organise a time to figure it out. And what we're doing there is often talking about behaviour. Okay, you've got this idea that we should all be respectful for one another. What would you need to see from the other people in the group for you to get the impression that there was more respectful communication happening? Or what kind of communication do you need for you to feel like that was respectful as opposed to not respectful? What's the line there? What are some examples of each? That kind of thing. So values could be about like we should be team players, this kind of thing. But often the way that we can actually resolve it in conflict is by going down to the behavior layer. What do you expect from one another and what are you prepared to do in return? So we've talked through relationship, data, interest, and value. And then the final type of conflict is what's called structural conflict. So this is often to do with the way that decisions are made or the way that communication happens. So in this group example here, the structural elements would be how frequently you are meeting, how the decisions were made about who's going to contribute what, how those expectations were outlined. Was that just a verbal conversation that happened? Is there some kind of a document that was sent out to you all? So maybe if we're aware of this problem potentially bubbling up, we could use a structural intervention here. Like perhaps we could suggest that we meet in one room and work on the report all together, so that therefore there's more opportunity to discuss any questions or go through any ambiguous clauses in the document and that kind of thing. And so then you could also have the opportunity to proofread, so to speak, the other person's work, and they're still sitting there in front of a computer, so that if anything needs to change, there's not such a rigmarole of them re-logging in and updating different versions and all of this kind of thing. So we can simplify the structure, take some of the friction out of the process and shift things in that direction that way. Or we could probably have looked back in time and thought through, how could we have made these expectations more clear earlier on? Like often there might have been a group conversation that happened, and it would have been better to follow through with an email just to make sure we're on the same page. This is what's going to happen by when. And maybe putting some reminders in people's diaries would be another option. Having weekly Zoom meetings or something like that to touch base. Asking for an update more frequently from your group members when you notice that there might be concerns sitting there about their contributions. These are all things that we might have done differently in hindsight. Some of these we can often still apply moving forward, and others they go into the learning opportunities, don't they, in terms of developing our reflective capacity and our ability to deal with conflict and manage difficult conversations. So how does that sit with you, thinking about conflict in terms of those categories, the relationship conflict, data conflict, interest, value, and structure? I wonder if that sounds like something that you might be able to apply to your current situation. And if so, I'd really encourage you to just spend a few moments doing this as a conflict analysis exercise. Writing it down is often more helpful. So I often just jot down those categories up the top of the page: relationship, data, interest, values, and structure. And then I kind of just come up with a big dot point list. To be honest, for me, just looking at those titles on the top of the page is enough that it begins to prompt me thinking about the same situation from different angles. And it kind of then tends to, I think, help me to come up with more depth in terms of my reflection. But writing it down also is really helpful for externalizing it. And I think that can be almost therapeutic for creating a little bit of differentiation from the people and the problems involved in this conflict, especially if we're finding it quite stressful. And it becomes something then on the page that's external to us, that's separate to us, that's different to us. And therefore, at least for me, and I know for some other people I've talked to as well, it doesn't feel as personal. We don't walk away then feeling as sticky. It's more like, well, at least now I've got a few steps that I can consider. I'm not sure if it's going to work or not, but at least I've got something that I can try. And therefore, I think we often shift the focus to more of an internal locus of control, where this is something that I'm going to be able to respond to. I can't fully control it, but regardless of what happens, there's options that I can use. So I hope that that's helpful for you. If you've got feedback, please let me know. You can shoot me an email. It's podcast@simongood.com. If you've got a case study that you would like me to discuss in a similar kind of fashion, please feel free to email that through as well. I'm always very, very open to those. Although in the past I have suggested that I'd be willing to do case studies, and I've sent some, and to be frank, some of them are half-recorded episodes that are still sitting there on my computer somewhere. So please don't interpret this as a promise, but I will do my best. If you'd like to send in a case study, they're the kind of thing that I really do find helpful for discussing on the podcast. If it's been helpful, I'd be very grateful if you'd consider leaving a positive review. And if you're on Spotify, putting a little comment or something like that. That kind of thing makes a massive difference for little podcasts like this. So thank you in advance if that's something that you're prepared to do. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully see you again in a future episode of the Conflict Skills Podcast. Bye for now.